did, with Andrew there.
Right. It's great, with great joy that I welcome all of us in the remote community as well as the folks in this room. And as we begin, I'll ask David to start us with a word of prayer.
Great. The honor to. Loving God, we thank you for this day that you have made. We need the rain. It's come, and we're grateful for all that this day brings. As the new program year begins, we are grateful for the gifts of heart and mind as they help us in adult education understand you better and the calling on our lives. We're grateful for Dr. Douglas, a dear friend of many of ours here, and for the willingness to share his gifts and wisdom with this community. And ask your blessing upon this year to come in adult ed and on this session today in particular. In Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.
As we begin, I'll just say one housekeeping thing. Apparently, the link that was in the email required a password. And if you're with us remotely, you pass that through that and you did it. But we will try to change that for next week so that you automatically get into the meeting. But if you also would like to have the link with that information, you could email me at carstarr@gmail.com, and I can send it to you so that you might have it on your calendar repeatedly. It's the same one for every week. And the only other thing that I would say is that we've had a really dedicated team of folks that have kept us up technologically over the years, but there are some differences in people's situations, and we're really looking for anyone that might be willing, not even every month, but to be on the team so that we can have some folks in our to back us up in case of any time. So if you would be willing to help us with, we can give you an on-the-spot training and printed instructions. Let us know, either if you're here in the room or remotely. We welcome your help. And we are so excited this morning to have Bruce Douglas with us once again. Bruce is an ongoing, very close friend, as you've heard, of adult education and of Bradley Hills. He's the founding director emeritus of the Reformed Institute, was a longtime associate pastor, Department of Government at Georgetown University. He has an MDiv from Yale and a PhD in political science from Duke, which qualifies him to be the Bradley Hills. And he's an active, ongoing elder at Lewinsville Presbyterian Church in McLean, and he will be helping us find out about Reformed political thought in the age of catastrophe from 1914 through 1945. I can say no more, except that Bruce does have a message for us, and he usually takes about 45 minutes for that message. Then we will welcome questions and answers after that. But if you have questions and you're remote, put them in the chat so that we can get to you. And if you're in the room, just hold on to those questions and we'll do our best to answer them. So, Bruce, thank you.
Very good to be back with you folks again. We've been doing this for a long time, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts with you folks at Bradley Hills and get your feedback. I would say parenthetically, some of you know this, I'm writing a book on the history of Reformed Protestant political thought, and these are segments that I've been offering to you as we go along. In each case, what I'm doing is talk about the development of this tradition, the figures who contributed to the formation of political ideas in the Reformed tradition as they interacted with various circumstances in their own time. And those circumstances, of course, change over time. This is a tradition of 500 years. Today, I want to talk about something which is the sequel to what I discussed last year, You may remember that if you were here, that I've talked about the rise of industrial societies, focusing on a period from the 1850s through the time of the First World War. And that was a period in which there were a lot of complexities to it, but there was a lot of optimism in reform thinking, reform Protestants who were very influential in many of the societies that were undergoing industrialization, including the United States. And they had reason, they thought, to have optimism about the direction in which things were going. And I mean moral optimism. They thought things were moving in a good direction, more democratic, more emphasis on human rights. Many of them embraced the expansion of democracy in that period, and so forth. And then comes the next phase, which the label, Carol correctly identified it, and I borrowed this term from a number of historians. My favorite is Eric Hobsbawm, who characterizes the period from 1914 to 1945 as an age of catastrophe, in which a whole series of things conspired to create very difficult challenges, very difficult problems. And in the course of dealing with those challenges, a fundamental change took place in Protestant thinking, not just about politics, but Protestant thinking generally. And I'm going to be talking in this series a lot about the pivotal figure in making that change, a man called Karl Barth, Barth, a Swiss theologian who now I think is recognized as one of the preeminent reform thinkers of all time. He's been put up in the same category with Calvin himself. He is an enormously influential figure in the English-speaking world as well as on the continent. And I would go so far as to say he was the theological source of mainstream Protestantism, not just Presbyterians, the source of of mainstream Protestantism in this country in the period of the Second World War and after, had a profound influence on our denomination in particular. So I'm going to be talking about him a lot. There are others I could mention. Reinhold Niebuhr would be one, but I'm going to focus on Barth because I think his Barth from the Reformed in the Reformed world is even more important. Why call it an age of catastrophe? I'm going to be talking about three things. Incredible experience of war that the people had in that period. Think about it. 1914 to 1945, terrible, terrible exposure to war and what many characterized as a new and different form of war. Secondly, next week I'm going to be talking about the emergence of radical ideologies and their gravitation to positions of power and influence. I'm talking about Leninism, Marxism, Leninism, or communism on the one side, and National Socialism, fascism on the other side. That's a dramatic change from what was true previously. I'll talk about that next week. And then, of course, the Depression, which led to not only political changes, the development of the regulatory state, the development of the welfare state, and so forth, but also a rethinking of political economy, a couple of sessions back, that is last year, I talked about a very important rethinking that was already going on with the rise of free market thinking that had an influence on reformed economic thought. I'll come back to talk about that theme in relation to the Depression 2 weeks hence. So today the focus is war. This was an age in which there were two large wars. There were all kinds of wars that took place previously, but these were large wars that actually appropriately came to be characterized as world wars, they were also characterized by people who looked domestically at the societies that were involved in this experience as total wars. That's a term that comes into being in this period. I don't see any antecedents for it. But historians, political scientists, and others, military strategists sometimes would talk about this, the emergence of the total war. I'll talk about that briefly in a moment. And then, of course, the term which was used above all about the First World War, and if you've lived in Europe, I've lived in Switzerland and for a time in Scotland, and to this day in the UK, there is a reference, constant reference, and even a very active commemoration of the Great War. The Brits talk about the Great War. Well, it was a great war because it was profound in its effects that to some extent, still are rippling out. It's hard, I think, to recapture. So let me try to do it very quickly. The sense of shock that accompanied the emergence of this First World War, this Great War. Some of you may be familiar with Barbara Tuchman's book on the Guns of August, which captures this beautifully. It was a kind of remarkable phenomenon from the point of view of people who were living through it, and it was on the whole, a shock that was not experienced as a good one. Why was that? Why? Historians looking back could say, well, there were all kinds of things that led to it, but of course, historians can see from the vantage point of history. At the time, there were indeed certainly clear evidences of saber rattling, mobilization of armies in some cases. That was part of it. But still, the whole experience came as a shock because the major European countries, there were all kinds of lesser countries, but the major European countries had not experienced any major war since the Napoleonic era. 1815 was the last major war. So I hope you see that's 100 years. Now, there were lesser wars. There were the Franco-Prussian War and various other things, but no major war in the sense of involving all the major powers. And as I emphasized a year ago, in this period, there were all kinds of things to encourage people if you wanted to be encouraged. Industrialization was moving forward, and it opened up the possibility of a spread of wealth in a way that was unprecedented. There was also, because of the absence of war, there was also a sense that more and more the coercive, violent tendencies of human beings were being brought under control, believe it or not. That encouraged people to think that maybe we were moving in the direction of what Kant characterized as steady movement in the direction of permanent peace. Permanent peace, a great philosophical idea as well as a political idea. So expanding opportunity for prosperity. Another part of this was expanding democratization, expanding evidence in some places of increasing control of the violent tendencies of human beings. And so you had this sense, which was very central to the mood of much of, particularly the intellectual, but also the political class in the middle and latter part of the 19th century, that we are moving in the direction of ever better conditions. And probably the outlawing of war, at least the marginalization of war. And then there comes this terrible reversal of all of that, terrible reversal. It's like you're moving along in a certain period. And by the way, I can't help but just interject. Just think back to the climate of opinion in the aftermath in our time, the aftermath of the collapse of communism. All sorts of very rosy pictures were painted of where we were headed. This is somewhat analogous to that. Then you get this outbreak of war, and it is a terrible war. By the way, let me say, the last great war that was comparable, historians now believe, that was comparable to the world wars of the 20th century was actually the religious wars that were spawned by the Reformation. In the period particularly between 1618 and 1648 led to the famous Treaty of Westphalia. That was the analogous thing. That was the world war of a long time ago. And many people, especially secular people, looking back say, well, that was because of all this religious craziness. And now that we're over with that, we can get on to a more sensible approach to life, which meant control of violent tendencies. Well, boy, was the World War a rude sort of contradiction of that aspiration. You had all the major European powers involved in this. That's the first thing I want to emphasize. All the major European powers. None of them were out of them. Now, the United States held out. It was not a European power, but all the major European powers were into this. So there was a slugfest among, you might say, the heavyweights. A slugfest among the heavyweights. And involved in this was something that I'm going to be talking about more in just a few moments, intense nationalism. Nationalism had been building. It was a 19th century phenomenon. More and more countries had this idea that the nation should be and could be turned into a cause. That's nationalism. The nation turned into a cause that you might what? Give your life for. And maybe even nobly give your life for in your own mind. That sort of trend, and by the way, Reformed Protestants, on the whole, as nationalism expanded in the 19th century, were enthusiastic about it, were positive about it. They were the pro-modern, pro-nation state party. You get all of that coming, you might say, to a crescendo in the intense nationalism of the First World War. And you can see why governments would want to feed it, would want to encourage it, because it encouraged support for the war efforts. You have intense nationalism, and let me say, the other side of the coin, it always needs to be remembered, intense hatreds. Intense nationalism in a military situation almost inevitably leads to intense hatreds. And we hate those Krauts. We hate those Brits. We hate those. They're terrible people. Whole moral defamation of peoples. And also, not unimportant in this, a lot of flag waving accompanied by religious claims. God is on our side. God is supportive. Our cause is God's cause. The wars were brutal. In this setting, I need not elaborate because all of us have been exposed to enough literature, enough video to be able to get a sense of that. But I want to stress how, in the sense in which it was brutal. It involved, of course, all of that trench warfare, hand-to-hand combat, massive armies involved in direct physical confrontation with one another that led to enormous bloodshed on all sides. But it wasn't just that. It was also, this was, from the point of view of the technology of the time, a technologically sophisticated war. It was hand-to-hand combat, but at the same time, it involved air power. It involved advanced munitions. So you had tanks, which introduced a whole new dynamic there, and air power above all. This was a war in which air power really made a difference, and that led to intense bombing campaigns. Indeed, in some cases, saturation bombing. And so you have this over time, and it wasn't very long after all, just 2 or 3 years, and yet it produced enormous death, enormous disruption of life, and the destruction, of course, of the physical conditions under which people live civilized lives as well. Let me speak briefly about that term I introduced earlier, total war. This is a very interesting concept. Political scientists have made a lot of this idea in thinking about what is distinctive, or what has been distinctive, about major wars in, shall we say, the industrial era. And that is because you have a much enhanced state capacity to control things. Modern technology does produce increased capacity on the part of the state to control things. And in wartime, in the First World War, Second World War even more, demonstrated this capacity. That is, the state takes it upon itself to mobilize every possible resource to fight on behalf of the war effort. Total war, so that there is an enormous reach of the war-making capacity into ordinary people's lives. Mobilize the economy, mobilize the educational system, mobilize even the religious forces in society, all to what? Pursue in a disciplined way that war effort. That's a very interesting concept. Wars, of course, previously had some of that, but not, to nowhere near the same degree, because you had lesser state capacity. one of the characteristics of modern life is that states get more and more capacity to do things that previously were difficult for them to achieve. By the way, I'll talk about this in a week or so, but that really is the source, that you might say the technical source of totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is a byproduct of industrialization because it presupposes a state which is able to control in a way that was not previously possible. Not only control people's actions, but people's thoughts as well, to some extent. It was a great war in all the different respects that I've characterized. But in addition, it was a great war in terms of its consequences, which are breathtaking when you think about it. The Great War brought to an end some very large, imposing empires, which for a long, long time, I would say all the way through the period I've been discussing, tracing out the history of the Reformed tradition in politics, all the way through that period, starting back with Calvin, you had these great empires, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russian Empire, and these were controlling all kinds of different peoples that today we think of now as separate nation states. Well, what happened in the Great War, the sort of the structure and to some extent the loyalty of people to those empires had been eroding before, had been declining before. But in the Great War, the infrastructure collapsed. And so, particularly the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it introduced a whole kind of chaotic situation, disorder in Eastern Europe, what we think of as Eastern Europe today. And of course, the collapse of the Russian Empire led, I just want to underscore this, that was the moment at which communism really became a significant force in modern politics, because the Bolsheviks seized power in October of 1917 in the chaos of the collapse of the Russian Empire. Needless to say, that unfolds a whole new chapter in politics. And then, of course, you can't talk about this war without also stressing the fact that it had a very one-sided settlement, a very one-sided, and I would say deliberately one-sided settlement. We all know Versailles, we all know Woodrow Wilson, all of that story, who came in with the idea of sort of finally institutionalizing this dream of the 19th century of a council of nations that would control things. In retrospect, you have to think about that event happening at the end of the First World War is kind of bitterly ironic in what followed. But it was a one-sided settlement. Keynes has a famous book on this in which he talks about what a terribly misguided settlement Versailles produced, because it was riddled with sentiments of revenge against those damn Germans, revenge against those forces on the other side, punishing them with all kinds of reparations that they found it very difficult to pay. And thereby, I hope you see, just to state the obvious, all of you know this, but let me underscore it, sowing the seeds for the next great war. You look at 1920s and the early 1930s, all that period is just strewn with unhappiness, alienation, bitterness on the part of the defeated powers, getting ready to what? Take their revenge in the next great war. Now, I will talk about the next great war later, but I'm going to talk about it I'm going to stop focusing on war now in this first presentation to talk about the impact of primarily the First War, although I'll ripple out a bit into the second one. The impact of that First War on Protestant theology, and especially on Reformed theology on the continent of Europe. Let me say that again. Reformed, that's our tradition, Reformed Protestant theology on the continent of Europe. You can't understand the development of serious theology in the Protestant world, and particularly in the Reformed world, without comprehending and focusing on, to some extent, the impact of this war. It was a turning point. It was a turning point in our tradition. And I say that for the following reason. Reformed theology in the 19th century had been drawn very much in a modernist direction, in a liberal direction, which meant, and let me just define those terms because of course they're very elusive. But liberal theology and its great sort of key figure is a man called Friedrich Schleiermacher that I talked about a year ago, comparable to Barth on the other side, you might say, in his significance, enormously creative man, enormously inventive man, who helped to reconstruct Reformed theology in a kind of modern form in the aftermath of in the wake of the Enlightenment. What do I mean by liberalism? I mean a combination of two things: humanitarianism and a strong idea of progress, a strong belief in progress. Humanitarianism and a strong belief in progress. You might translate it into this very simple idea: looking at democracy, looking at another part of this, by the way, is the elimination of serfdom, the elimination of slavery, the emergence of humane conditions in the workplace that were being fought for and so forth, and this hope of eventually eliminating war, at least marginalizing war. All of that translated in the liberal mind into the following idea: the kingdom of God is actually being realized in our time. The kingdom of God is actually being realized in our time, or at least we're approximating it. We're doing a pretty good job of approximating it because conditions are more and more conforming to what a gospel ethic would dictate. Then comes the war. And within almost seconds, something happens which just startled people like Karl Barth. Karl Barth had been educated under the tutorship of people who were liberal theologians, and he was an early liberal. He was a Swiss Reformed pastor who initially made his name as a pastor in a small church. He wasn't a university professor somewhere, but for Karl Barth and his generation, people like Emil Brunner, and on the other side of the Atlantic, people like Reinhold Niebuhr and Richard Niebuhr. They were all young men in this period. They were literally coming to maturity in this period of the war. And the thing that shocked Barth, he says later, well, one image he uses, the scales fell from my eyes. His teachers, on the whole, having talked all this good line about the marginalization of war and the coming of the kingdom of God on earth and so forth, all of those people, with hardly any exceptions, when the war happened, immediately turned around and became proponents of a war theology. They embraced the national cause. He characterizes their position as theology as warmongering. They were very strong proponents of God is on our side kind of theology. Now, Barth was shocked by that, and he was offended by it. He thought it was just obviously clear manifestation of the fact that when the rubber hit the road, these people, their convictions amounted to nothing. They did a flip-flop within, as I say, just a year, just a few days. And not only that, they were very open about this. They weren't quiet about it. They made proclamations allying the German Protestant cause with the war effort. And Barth was appalled by that. And he was very outspoken, and as a young man, a very young man, began denouncing the people who had been involved in this hypocritical move towards defending the war effort. And he said, in this pastorate, he's in as I say, in a pastorate in a small village. Actually, it was a village that had a combination of industry and agriculture, but it was a small village. He had a church of something like 500 members, which was not huge. It was not terribly small, but by the standards of the time, it was a small church in a Germany which was very religious. In that place, he said, and he began to correspond with friends and so forth. He said, I didn't know what to say from the pulpit. The theology that I had been drawing upon in my preaching, and that's what clergy do, of course, especially coming out of seminary. Their minds have been formed in a certain way. They have certain ideas about the gospel, and then they translate that into sermons. That's the kind of beginning of a theologically informed body of sermons. He was very much that way. He wanted to preach good sermons that were founded on good theology, and yet the theology that he was drawing upon in his early years in the pastorate was what he characterized as this bankrupt theology, which had been led to this terrible about face on the part of prestigious faculty, academics mainly, but also other church leaders. And in that moment, he said, and he was corresponding with, it was a generational quality to this, absolutely. Looking back, you can see he's corresponding with other guys, and they're mainly in their late 20s. They're in their late 20s. And by the way, all of us have seen things like this before. A younger generation, educated. I can remember coming out of the 50s into the 60s, a lot of those feelings about some things that not so much that I had been taught, but that were prevailing in American culture. So we have a kind of generational dynamic here, but Bart is the great leader because what he does is the following. He says, we've got to go back to basics and we simply got to reread the Bible. We've got to return to the Bible and figure out where is it in that massive book? Where is it that we can find a foundation for a theology which is defensible, a theology which is not utterly compromised by the nonsense that's going on around our eyes. And he was, let me add, he was appalled by the war. He was just, he thought, not only was it bad for these Germans to be embracing this war theology, but it was also bad that many of them took a kind of satisfaction in war heroics. And he has the very sharp observations about the utterly unchristian quality of embracing these war heroics. You can imagine what he's talking about. As just utterly wrong. So he's appalled by what quickly became evident that one of his main targets was this intense, uncritical nationalism, which he eventually called demonic, intense nationalism, demonic, and also the war effort, which he said brought out the worst in human beings. He said it just naturally draws human beings. This kind of war, he said, just illustrates in spades the evil of which human beings are capable. There's nothing to glory in it. There's nothing about it that should justify glory. Those were his instincts. But the thing that really put him on the map, and I have to say, it's a little bit like, Calvin wrote the first edition. There were many editions of the Institutes, but the first edition was written when he was in his 20s. I'm just it's a mind-boggling phenomenon because it was breathtaking in its depth and its breadth, and he was a new convert to the Protestant cause. I mean, it just amazes me. Young man writing this brilliant work at the beginning of what eventually became a larger work. It's a little bit like this with Bart. Bart turned in particular to Paul, and isn't it very interesting? I've been studying this as I've been working on this book. All along, Reformed Protestants say we are founding our political ideas on biblical ideas. The Bible is our source. But they read the Bible differently depending upon the circumstances in which they find themselves. And in this, you might say, grim situation. By the way, Niebuhr eventually characterized Barth's situation. He says, Barth's theology is really a theology for the catacombs. He was talking particularly about the Second World War, but there's some of that quality to it. Things are really going to hell in a handbasket, and we've got to cope with that situation. By the way, that was not an unrealistic feeling for somebody who's living in a German-speaking culture, which is drawn rather naturally in this situation to embrace the war effort. He turned in particular to the book of Romans. Let me pause. To the book of Romans, arguably the great text of Reformed Protestantism, because that's where not only Calvin, but even Luther turned in their pivotal moves in reconstructing the theology they inherited. He turned to the book of Romans and wrote and was published, young man, barely could find a publisher, in 1918, probably the most important book of Reformed theology in the 20th century. And that is his commentary on the book of Romans, which was much more than just a commentary on the book of Romans. It was a commentary on the events of his time, intertwined. It reads today like a highly polemical, you can almost feel this anger that's woven, but at the same time, a sense of gratitude. Here is the real gospel, he said. Here is the real gospel, and it is a gospel which reminds us over and over and over again. He quotes Romans 7. And by the way, if there's any doubt in your mind about what Romans 7 means, go back and read it after this session is over. He focused in particular on the 7th chapter of Romans. He says it reminds us over and over again of our moral weaknesses, our moral failings, and the fact that the first word that is appropriate for it to be spoken to us on behalf of God is a word of judgment. We need judgment. We need to be sensitive to our limitations, our failings, before we ever start talking about grace. By the way, he was a friend of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and much approved that famous phrase out of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, cheap grace. You might say Barth is kind of a militant warrior against the idea of cheap grace, grace which is not founded in a deep sense of repentance and a sense of a need for forgiveness. Here are a few ideas from the Rummer Brief, as it was called, the commentary on the book of Romans. He said, it is biblical to say, and this is just very much in keeping with Calvin and Luther before him, that all of our capacities, including our capacity to reason, all of our capacities are deeply compromised by sin. All of our capacities are deeply compromised by sin, so that even our best efforts, even our most noble achievements are compromised by the sinful tendencies that we all have. We have to be aware of that, he said, because that should caution us against any simple identification of our cause with God's cause. Our cause may be somewhat one that is in keeping with God's purposes, but only somewhat. It's always compromised by our own selfishness, etc. But he also said, if you look carefully at those texts in Romans in particular, there is a clear awareness. Paul has it, he says, in a clear-eyed way. At one point, he says, Paul is right and Kant is wrong. Paul is right and Kant is wrong. And I think he's frankly doing a disservice to Kant. I think Kant was a little more complicated than this, but still, you can understand his point. He said, all of this talk about optimistic talk about how much progress we're making towards the realization of godly purposes on earth neglects the fact, as illustrated in the war above all, that human beings are always capable of profound evil. Human beings are always capable of profound evil, and just when you think things are going well, you need to not expect, but be wary of the possibility of profound evil breaking out. And becoming a source of great problems in our lives. The implication, and then one other comment on that, he said, modern life, some of this reads just like it was written yesterday. Modern life, he said, modern life tends to draw people in the direction of great illusions about the achievements of modern societies. It draws us naturally in that direction. We want to believe those things. We very much want to believe those things. And some of us uncritically do embrace those things, but it's nonsense, at least from the perspective of Paul in his writings, especially in Romans. And if we took those ideas seriously, he said, in turn, Christians are bound to be, to some extent, people, and this is one of the great phrases associated with Barth, swimming against the stream, against the modern stream. Christians, he said, Christian discipleship leads you naturally to swim to some extent against the stream. There's a famous collection of his writings called Against the Stream. In particular, he singled out two things in this period of his life that he thought were evil. Evil. This is a very strong word, and he used it with, I would say, considerable precision. One was nationalism. Nationalism, he said, had become demonic in his time. The embodiment of, and by the way, important thing to note, in the previous century, nationalism on the whole had been embraced and affirmed by Protestant thinkers because Protestants, being more modern than Roman Catholics, almost by definition, were much more inclined to be comfortable with the emergence of the nation-state system. Roman Catholics have always been rather more critical of the nation-state system and anxious to somehow see it controlled, limited, and so forth. National autonomy, in particular, they find very problematic. Barth is at a crucial moment turning that in a different direction and saying nation states are all too easily become embodiments of evil. And the idea that the nation should become a cause is a recipe for demonic tendencies in human beings, especially when nation is set against nation. He said that has got to be contrary to God's will. And then the other thing, he thought modern war, and this is the beginning of a lifelong crusade on his part, he said modern war is really dangerous stuff and all too easily leads to profound evil. Let me say that again. Modern war in particular, war has always been a problem, but modern war in particular draws people in the direction of really bad behavior, demonic behavior, and therefore needs to be resisted. Now, the interesting thing about that is that having said that, I'm about to close here, but having said that, I have to then quickly go on to say that Karl Barth was not a pacifist, was not a pacifist. And that became dramatically evident in the Second World War, where, as many of you know, he became a very outspoken critic of National Socialism. And actually he was teaching in Germany at the time, and because of his refusal to accept imposition on his academic freedom, you might say, as a professor. Eventually, he refused to do all kinds of things that were expected, and eventually he was dismissed. Fortunately, he did not go to a concentration camp because he was Swiss and he was allowed to leave the country and went to Basel. But in Basel, he then turns around and becomes such an outspoken critic of the Nazis and to some extent the Germans generally, that he was actually silenced for a while by the Swiss authorities. I did not know that until recent work on Barth. But he was told in effect to shut up. This is because the Germans were pressuring the Swiss, saying, "Well, if you allow people like Barth to mouth off in opposition to us, your neutrality is a hollow thing. If you're going to really be consistent in that proclamation of neutrality, you got to control this. You got to." And so he was subject to surveillance by his own government, and pressure was put on him. He didn't completely submit, but pressure was put on him to tone it down, shut it up, go teach theology. Don't talk about politics. Instead, Karl Barth became, not just in Switzerland, but kind of internationally. The BBC, for example, caught wind of the fact that he was an eloquent speaker, and they sent through the BBC messages to the German people from this theologian that basically said a war against Nazism is required. A war against Nazism is required. And not only does there need to be a war against this menace, but he said it has got to be destroyed completely because it is a demonic force. He said Adolf Hitler in particular is the embodiment of evil, and it's got to be dismissed. So when the United States entered the war effort in the Second World War, he was very supportive of that. But having said that, now let me qualify it again. He was not, even in the most intense parts of his arguments about the need for military action against the Nazis, the need to defend the Nazis and so forth, the need to defend those powers. He was never of the opinion, and he made this very clear, that it was permissible to attack them and defeat them by whatever means were available. A lot of that thinking was developing in that period. It led eventually, of course, to the dropping of bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Barth was very critical of that. He said, you cannot possibly be a moral person, let alone a spiritually grounded person, and believe that any and all resources that are available to governments to wage war are permissible. He was very critical, for example, of saturation bombing. He said, there's no way that this can be considered to be morally acceptable. And he went on to say, and this became one of his great crusades of the 1950s and 60s, he said, the amassing of atomic and then nuclear weapons is impermissible. It is morally impermissible. And as a result, he became a very outspoken proponent of what has come to be known as nuclear pacifism. He was not a pacifist, but he was a nuclear pacifist. By the way, when he made his one trip to the United States in the early 1960s, the Kennedy administration was in power, and in a tour where he was kind of celebrated as this enormously important figure, not just religiously but otherwise, picture on the cover of Time magazine and so forth. There was a meeting that I would love to have been attending as a fly on the wall, because there's no record of it. But he had a meeting with government officials, high-level government officials. McGeorge Bundy was there and various other people, on precisely this issue of atomic weapons. And apparently it was, as one person who attended it, Arthur Schlesinger, said, it was a very lively exchange of views. You know what that's code for. One final thing and then I'm done. Summary to be developed further in the weeks to come. Bart, like Niebuhr, was intensely political. Intensely political. He's the one who said, you've probably heard this quoted at some point, maybe from David Gray, I don't know. In order to really be a responsible Christian in our time, you need to be the following. You need to be reading the Bible in the one hand and your newspaper in the other, and constantly seeing the interaction between the two. He once said, a church which is uncomfortable with politics from the pulpit needs to rethink its purpose. Needs to rethink its purpose. And clearly, the implication was that, and by the way, he had a real conflict with pietists who argued precisely that. Got to keep politics out of religion. Bart was intensely political, and he thought it was, to further develop a point here, he thought it was the responsibility of Christians in our time to be politically engaged. That's a pretty strong message. You need to, it's your responsibility as a Christian to be politically engaged. And he further argued the following. It is the responsibility of Christians in our time not only to be politically engaged, but to be partisan. He was very caustically critical of people who said, well, on the one hand, but on the other, we recognize all points of view here. He was very critical of that. He said, it is the responsibility of Christians to be politically not only engaged, but partisan. But then he said, last nuance here, and a very important one. He says it's a wrong idea for Christians to identify with Christian movements with that label, like the Christian Democratic Party or the Christian Socialist Movement. He said that's not the way for Christians to be involved in public life. He said that all too easily creates all sorts of problems, including Christianity being identified too narrowly with one political agenda. That's wrong. I hope you see why this is a complicated thing to think out. His last comment on this, or at least the last one I'm going to offer for you this morning, was the following. Something which has been much more appealing in the Anglo-Saxon world than on the continent of Europe. The continent of Europe was filled with Christian democratic movements. And by the way, in the aftermath of the Second World War, Christian democracy became, for a time, almost a dominant force in many of the countries involved. Barth dismissed that as a Catholic idea. He said, that's what the Catholics do. We Protestants prefer, and it's right for us to prefer, a kind of anonymous presence, anonymous Christian presence in the public square. That is, we, depending on how we think through the faith, we identify with this party or that party, but we don't grab for ourselves the label Christian and stick it on our particular political movement. And he then underscored that was a kind of freedom which he thought was essential to the gospel, that was made a lot more sense to Protestants than it did to Roman Catholics. And I hope you see this is the development here of a very interesting and I would say nuanced political ethic that, of course, extends well beyond Barth's time. Now, having said all that, I think I've just about done what I need to do this morning. You need to tell me where I went wrong. The floor's open.
Oh, Bruce, wow, so much food for thought. I'll start out with one comment or question that in the chat from Pat Stocker, who, get this up here, says, for Americans, the Civil War was certainly a major war.
Yep, it was.
With ideological bases. So we, as many other countries, had experienced a great war experience for our own country.
Yep.
Did this also affect our theology?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Just a wonderful question. And it's a good complement to what I was saying, because as Americans, you have to think, well, wait a minute, does this idea of the war, of ideological war, sort of fading from the scene in the 19th century works make sense? And of course, it doesn't. By the way, the American Civil War was one of the bloodiest wars in history, not just in American history, but in history. I would say that that war and the way it played out and the causes that it had affected our religious life in a way that has never gone away. And let me describe. It was, of course, a profound fissure, a profound divide among people in their own religious communions. There were, I'm sure all of you know, there were Reformed Protestants on both sides of that effort who developed their own theologies in defense of their positions and also their conduct in the war. And for the longest time, you had in the South one kind of theology uh, which endured after the war, and another kind of theology that prevailed in the North. Now, I would say the reason why that it didn't just go away after the war, that fissure, that divide, for the following reason. In that same period, you get the emergence of evangelicalism and fundamentalism, and they become, in not entirely, but in large part, an extension of the kind of theology which was prevalent in the South in the period of the Civil War and the lead up to the Civil War. It goes without saying to say that endures. It goes without saying that is part and parcel of our religious reality, and the division between those two strains in theology was um, was has endured. I would add one other thing which is important to note. For a while, in the heyday of neo-orthodoxy, Protestant neo-orthodoxy, which I would characterize as the period after the Second War, say 1945 to 1960, Barth's ideas. Barth was in some respects theologically conservative, in other respects not at all conservative. Barth's theology seemed to be bridging that divide between the American North and the American South, American liberals and American conservatives, talking about theology, seemed to be a way of bridging that divide and overcoming it. And by the 1970s, it was clear that was not the case, that the Barthian moment, if you will, had passed, and we are returned to this deep fissure in American Protestantism between liberals and conservatives that has a distinct parallel to the Civil War. That's a long-winded answer, but believe you me, that's the short
Wow.
version.
Great question, and thank you so much. Steve Fox.
Going back to a comment that you made early on, Professor, back in 2016, Bradley Hills did a pilgrimage to Scotland. Well, our choir performed 4 concerts across Scotland. The last one was at the village church in Eggleston, which is a little village about 45 minutes outside Edinburgh. It was really, really clear the identification that even rural Scotland had with king and country, and how the church was part of that. They had brass plaques on the walls of the sanctuary itself. In this beautiful stone village church from the early 19th century with the picturesque parish cemetery next to it and the flocks of sheep on the hillsides over there. And you look in the dictionary for rural Scotland and there's a picture of Eggleston Church. Inside the sanctuary, there were brass plaques commemorating the members of that congregation who had served in India in the 19th century, including the women and children and the deaths that had occurred out of that parish. There was one for the Great War, there was one for the Second World War, there was one for the Falkland Islands. The largest of them was for the Great War. And the pastor of that parish had done his research, and every day during the period from 2014 to 2018, at noon on the 100th anniversary of one of the deaths of those many, many soldiers who from that parish had died. On that 100th anniversary, he rang the church bell at noon so that the whole village would hear it. And that's how front and center the Great War still was, even in this little back corner of Scotland. It was really, really striking.
That to me reminds me of something I experienced. My wife and I had a sabbatical, and I was working on a project, and we were living in Scotland in the early 2000s. And in the middle of a shopping spree and a shopping trip to Marks and Spencer, famous chain department store in Scotland, in Edinburgh, I was going about my business, and all of a sudden, there was a bell in the department store, bell that was rang, and everybody stopped for a 1-minute moment of commemoration of those who had fallen in the memory of those who had fallen in the Great War. A dumb American. I had to figure out what they were doing. You know, these are young and old and so forth, and this was, the early 2000s. It was a kind of a remarkable demonstration of how, just what you're saying, Steve, there was this living memory still very much in people's minds.
I've been in Europe on November 1st numerous times, and it's a very day of reverence, and everyone visits the cemeteries. It's very impressive. Very
Everybody
different
still
from ours.
sports a poppy that day.
Yes, yeah. Kurt.
So, regarding your comment about Barth was very much in favor of partisanship.
Yep.
So was I guess I'm trying to picture his ideal then as sort of pick a side but worship together. Was that what he was hoping for, or what was it?
Yes, I think that's not a bad way to put it. But I would add the following. Be prepared for the sermon itself to have a politically partisan quality, because the purpose of a sermon, among other things, is to enable people to try to have some understanding of the Word of God's application to their own time, their own place. And he thought it was not appropriate for a pastor simply to speak in generalities about that. Now, he also said it was not appropriate for clergy to be constantly commenting on everything that was a public issue. If there was a controversy about the school budget, that was probably didn't rise to the level of significance. We're talking about things of deep moral and spiritual significance. But when those things arise, it is entirely appropriate for the pastor to preach, and in fact, is probably derelict for him not to say something, or her for that matter, to say something about in a very partisan way from the pulpit. But he was very clear that the church would be made up of people who had differing views on political matters.
May I make a comment?
Sure.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think that's probably going to be our last one, but thank you, John. Go ahead.
Yeah. By the way, thank you so much for speaking today, sir. I enjoyed it, if that's the appropriate term. Certainly learned a lot. But anyway, but but here's the danger of the pastor going too far, because oftentimes they're, shall we say, sharply divided contingents, as it were, or groups in a particular church. So he or she, then the pastor, risks alienating one quarter or one party versus the other. And I certainly saw that in our church when there was the issue of whether a gay pastors, should be out and so forth. And we had it in the presbytery. We had it in the session of which I was a member at the time. Some people refused to vote for opening up the pastorship to those who were gay, and we had a gay pastor at the time. And I certainly saw it at the presbytery level where I was a delegate or a commissioner. Anyway, but that's the problem the pastor faces, and yet he or she should speak out, in my view. So there's the anomaly, in my view, sir. Thank you.
Well, this is worth, I want to say, this is a topic that is well worth serious discussion in places like this forum. And let me frame it this way. You have expressed, but I have been where you have been many times. I'm a lay person, and I've sat on sessions and been on various committees and so forth where pastor nominating committees where we've dealt with this issue. You have summarized very well what I would characterize as the pragmatic considerations that church leaders have to take into account in thinking about the future of the congregation. Bart was uninterested in that. And I think to some extent was even dismissive of. On what grounds, you might say? I mean, good Lord, what could be more important than the maintenance of the membership of the church, the maintenance of the base necessary to keep the operation going? I think he would say if a pastor is preaching in that way, he's got the wrong idea about preaching. He's thinking about, I'm a CEO here, I'm managing the congregation, I've got to worry about those strategic considerations. That's the wrong point. He should always be thinking, now, what is the right thing for me to say based upon the text I'm preaching? What is the right thing for me to say? And as much as possible, then to create a climate in the congregation in which people are respectful of the role of the sermon in enabling people to understand how this theologically trained person thinks about this topic. And hopefully to hear something that isn't always exactly what they agree upon. I mean, at one point, Bart also said, if people expect from sermons all the time agreement with their politics, they need to be educated. That's not the purpose of the church. That's not the purpose of sermons. Now, I just want to stress, I think it would be wonderful to have a conversation about those two different points of view and their role in the life of the church. And I fully understand, by the way, that oftentimes in the American scene in particular, in the American situation in particular, where you've not got established churches, you've got voluntary churches, which depend upon their appeal to the clientele, in effect, that they serve. In American churches in particular, this oftentimes put the pastor, he or she, in a very difficult position. But it seems to me Bart's voice on this topic is obviously one of, if not the most important considerations. I'll state flatly that.
Thank you so much, Bruce. We have a lot to look forward to in the coming weeks, but your message today was particularly relevant. We're having meetings about the church, the futures of our church. This is a week where there was an executive order to change the name of the Defense Department to the Department of War. And we're living in very, very challenging times. And as disciples of faith, we have a lot to deal with. And you're helping us so very much. I'll just say one other thing that you contact me, CARSTARR @gmail.com if you'd like the link. If you can help us technologically, we would love to have you and as part of us. And we just welcome all of you as we begin this program year. And just one more comment is that we miss so much Todd McCright, who was definitely such an important member of our church and has been a member of adult ed and attending, and celebrate his life and the many contributions that he made, as well as Dr. Douglas, who has been so steadfast in supporting us in our understanding. Thank you. See you next week.
Take care. Have a good week.
Yes.